I'm Nancy Simmons. I'm the curator in charge of the Department of Mammalogy at the American Museum of Natural History. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about bats. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and my research has focused on bats for the last 30 years. I'm interested in understanding the amazing diversity of bats. Most people know that there are different kinds, but it goes far beyond that. There's over 1,400 living species of bats. They live on every continent except Antarctica, and some tropical areas have over 100 species which are coexisting in the same place at the same time. I find this fascinating. My research involves describing and cataloging this diversity and trying to figure out how and why it evolved. I work with everything from DNA to fossils, and I do field work yearly to collect samples and ecological data on bats and to help protect bats and ensure their conservation. A lot of this work is highly collaborative, and I work in the field, in the lab, in the museum with many other bat specialists, including my colleague here today, Dr. Angelo Soto-Centeno.
Howdy, folks. I am Angelo. I am a mammalogist and a professor at Rutgers University, and I am also a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History in the Department of Mammalogy. Kind of similar to Nancy, I caught my first bat, about 20 years ago now, when I was a youngster running around the hills in Puerto Rico. And since then, I've been really fascinated by their ecology and evolution. And so far, I've been happy to be able to study these animals throughout the Caribbean as well as other places in tropical America. I think that if you were to ask me, bats are really unique because they're the only mammals that can fly, and this makes them like really good for moving across space. And this peculiarity really caught my attention early on, and that still forms part of my integral part of my research, which particularly focuses on understanding how bat communities are formed and how they change through time, specifically to pinpoint how new species of bats are formed and how some others become extinct. Now, before we go and answer all of your questions, I'm sure you're really eager to jump into the picture. Let's actually take a quick parenthesis and look at a quick video of some of the research I did a few years ago in Cuba. And if you have questions while you're watching, let's go ahead and just type them in or post them in the comments, and we're actually going to answer them on screen right after the video.
As a kid growing up in Puerto Rico, I was always running around in the field and catching snakes and lizards, but I really was in love with animals that could fly. Bats are super special because in the Caribbean there's only a handful of native mammals remaining, and of all of those groups, bats are always the most species rich. And that makes them really unique because we can use bats as a tool or as a model to study how changes in mammal communities have happened over time. My name is Angelo Soto-Centeno, and I am a research associate at the Department of Mammalogy at American Museum of Natural History.
If you want to understand how species have evolved over time around the whole Caribbean, Cuba is like a key piece of the puzzle. The main island is really much larger than any other island in the Caribbean. And that means that it has more of a diversity of environments. Organisms are able to arrive into the island and then they're isolated for long periods of time. And that allows evolution to proceed in new and unpredictable ways. I'm Anna Luz Porzakansky, Director of the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History. The museum has been collaborating with Cuban scientists from different institutions for over 100 years. Some of our specimens were collected by renowned Cuban naturalist Juan Gundlach and date from before the museum was founded. The museum collections hold many Cuban specimens, for example, Megalochnus rodents, the giant ground sloth that used to live in Cuba, as well as jade, invertebrates, fish, herbs, and bats.
For my research, I'm interested in bat biodiversity and causes of extinctions of bats in the Caribbean. Professionally, Cuba was very exciting for me because I've worked in the Caribbean for many years. And Cuba was the only island that I hadn't visited. And yet this island is so important to really understand the patterns of distributions that we have across these bats in the Caribbean.
The Explore 21 expedition to Cuba wanted to explore an area that hadn't been explored very often in the last few decades. And we brought together scientists from the American Museum of Natural History, the Cuban National Museum of Natural History, and Humboldt National Park, focusing on what can we document and detect in these forests. And how does this compare to what has been registered there before?
I know the biodiversity of Cuba pretty well from books, but never have seen a true Cuban bat in my hand. So that was really amazing. We would go out in the afternoon and we search for good sites in which we're going to put our nets. Try to go to sleep for a couple hours because at 4:30 in the morning I got to wake up and go check the harp trap, take out the bats that have been caught by this trap overnight, and then I start collecting all the data that I need. Wing punching, it's a pretty interesting technique that allows us to sample a small piece of bat tissue to use for genetic analysis. And then the bat is released and it goes home with a tiny small hole, but it grows back within 2 weeks, 3 weeks or something like that. Personally, Cuba was also very rewarding because I got to work with Gilberto Silva. He is, in my opinion, one of the greatest mammalogists in the Caribbean, and he's been studying bats since the 40s and working with scientists at the American Museum since the 1950s.
Dr. Gilberto Silva Taboada has been a remarkable advocate and force for science in Cuba. He was the one who came up with the idea and really helped formalize the first National Museum of Natural History in Cuba. And of course, he has also promoted conservation of many of these species.
A principios de la década de los años 40, yo ingresé en la Sociedad Espeleológica de Cuba, que como conoces, se dedica al estudio de las cuevas. Y ahí me empecé a chocar por primera vez con los murciélagos. Yo tengo que estudiar estos bichos, voy a dedicar toda mi vida a estudiar esto.
After our expedition, Silva visited us at the mammalogy collections here in New York City.
Ahora vamos a ver esta cabecita, tengo un cráneo aquí súper bien preservado, lo vemos y lo comparamos con lo que está en la colección.
Pero es fósil.
Sí, ese es su fósil, esto tiene como 1000 años nada más.
Ajá.
Sí, esto es de ayer.
For my research in the Caribbean, I also look at fossils. For the most part, the fossils that we search for are species that we have today. Once we collect all the fossil information, we can plot it on a map and see the past distribution of a species.
Parte de mi programa es investigar, comparar el pasado con el presente. Entonces poder hacer esa imagen de cómo las comunidades han cambiado a través del tiempo, especialmente en Cuba, sería muy, muy chévere.
Using climate models, the fossil data, and the genetics will help us put together a whole big story about how climate change itself in the past probably affected bats in the Caribbean. So far, we've only been able to put half of a story. Right? Now with this new information that we get from Cuba, we have evidence at a particular place in time that allow us to make comparisons not only in present day, but also towards the past.
Every specimen that we have is really valuable, and that's why also we welcome so many scientists, including Cuban scientists, to come and study our collections.
Encuentro.
All right, guys, I hope that you enjoyed that little video. We've actually been showered with a bunch of questions right now, and we're going to start, fending off some of the early questions that came in, and we're just going to take them in order. Remember, we're going to have plenty of chance to answer many more questions later on. And one of the first questions that came up was, do bats have feathers? The short answer is no, right? Bats are mammals, and they share common ancestry with us humans, for example. And one of the synapomorphies, or the distinguishing traits of all mammals, is that they actually have hair. While some mammals today, when you see them, they actually may not look hairy, for example, like a whale or something. They don't really seem to have hair. This is actually a secondary loss of hair. When you actually look up closer at any bat you'll see that there's actually plenty of hair on all of these little creatures.
Okay, I'll take the next one. One of our viewers asked, how many breeds of bats are there? Well, when we're talking about wild animals, we don't talk about breeds because breeds are things that are created by humans breeding dogs, breeding cats. So they take one species and try and amplify certain traits to make it a larger or smaller. In the wild, we talk about species, and there's actually over 1,400 different species of bats. So, and different parts of the world have different bat fauna, so different community of animals living together. But right now, as we keep track, there are new bat species described every year. The numbers keep going up as we study them more, as we discover completely new ones. And also we discover some new bats by examining materials that we've had in museum collections for a long time, looking more closely using genetic techniques, for example. And we discover that something we once thought was one widespread species is actually several species that have much more restricted ranges. So 1,421 is the number now, but come back a week from now and there'll probably be more.
Nancy, actually, I have another question as a follow-up. I heard pretty recently there was a bat named after you. Can you tell us the number of that particular species?
Well, actually, that's not on the list yet because it was just published last week. It's a huge honor to have a species named after you. And so there's now a small bat with big ears from the genus Micronicterus, which is named Micronicterus simmonsi. And I'm just thrilled to death to have this named after me. It's a huge honor. It's very exciting.
What an honor. That's fascinating. All right, let's actually take another question. One of our viewers asked, how crucial are bats as pollinators around the world? The role of bats as pollinators is pretty important. And you might actually have heard, really interesting stories about, people combining like, well, if you like tequila, then you would love bats because there's a particular bat that commonly is known as the tequila bat that would actually pollinate the flowers of the agave, the plant that we actually extract tequila from. But beyond just the agave itself, which is, multi-million-dollar annual industry, right? As we know, we get benefits from pollination of bats in all sorts of different ways. For example, if you like bananas, many bat species actually pollinate the banana flowers. If you like mangoes, those are also often pollinated by bats, and so on and so forth. And not only fruits that, for example, we can actually buy in the grocery store. Bats are also pollinators of many native plants, and they also keep, by doing these pollination services, they help maintain the health of the ecosystems in our forests.
Yeah, bats are critical to ecosystems in all sorts of different ways, not just pollination. There are many fruit-eating bats in tropical regions, and they're critical for dispersing seeds of plants in forests. So they eat the fruit, they fly somewhere else, they poop it out, and then new plants can grow there. They're also very important in controlling insects, particularly insect pests are critical for agriculture. It's been estimated that bats eat the equivalent, well, it would cost something over $50 billion to do the same amount of pest control that bats do for free if you use pesticides and so on in North America. But in tropical forests, they help maintain different population levels of different insects. So all of these roles are part of what keeps our ecosystems healthy all over the planet, and bats play a key role there. One other question that was asked by one of our viewers is, have you or are you going to continue the search for common ancestors of bats and their closest relatives? Well, my background was actually originally in paleontology before I discovered bats, and I've been lucky enough to be involved in studying and describing some of the oldest fossil bats. These animals are over 50 million years old, but they're clearly bats. They have well-formed wings, and if you could see my hand here with my fingers, the bat's wings are basically made of fingers. So in the picture behind me on the screen, you can see the arm of a bat, and it's long, skinny fingers that are supporting the membrane that the bat uses to fly. And we can see this in fossils because we can see the bones of the wings. So 50 million years ago, bats already existed and were diverse. They were all over the planet. And we're not quite sure where their origins lie in terms of exactly what their ancestors look like, but we know that they belong to a group that includes a lot of other mammalian groups including ungulates, amazingly, might be the closest living relatives of bats, might be things like deer and cattle and horses. So their common ancestor is very different than those groups are today.
So we have another question from one of our viewers, and it's actually pretty simple. How long do bats live? And the truth is that there's actually quite a wide range of variability in how long a bat would actually be able to live. And it actually kind of varies depending on the species that you're looking at. Some actually will be living perhaps as little as a decade, but also bats are known to be extremely long-lived among mammals, especially in relation to their size, right? For being such a little mammal, the record of longevity for the longest lived bat is over 40 years. So you can imagine that, you know, if you were actually to correct that by size, that's like for us living several hundred years, right? It would be really amazing to live that long, for example.
Okay, one of our viewers has asked, do bats form social bonds beyond their immediate families? The answer to this is definitely yes. Bats have very complex social lives. They live in different kinds of social groups depending on the species. There are some species that form pair bonds like humans, so a male and a female bat will stay together and raise offspring, but bats also live in all sorts of other groups. In some cases where there's a single male, multiple females, and they would form tight bonds with all the members of their group. As in many mammalian groups, it's the females which form close bonds, and often it's the males that disperse to other groups when the teenagers become restless and off they go to make their way somewhere else with females of other groups. But yes, very tight bonds, and this also goes along with their long lifespan. These are not short-lived animals, so they may spend decades together with the same individuals.
We got a question here that just popped up. Are there any good places to see bats near New York City at night? Absolutely. I'll tell you really quickly from an anecdotal point of view, right? One afternoon, I was actually waiting to watch a play of Shakespeare in the Park. And as I'm waiting at dusk, I just look up and there is a hoary bat flying overhead. I could tell what it was because it's a really large size bat. So Central Park is actually a really good spot to watch bats, particularly when it's like still kind of light enough that you can actually see them flying around, and you will actually be able to pick up a few. Other places that you can find bats, and sometimes actually flying fairly low, are the corridors in Riverside Park. Particularly look for really wooded areas that may form a little bit of a tunnel, and you will see several red bats and myotis flying through those tunnels, as well as in the High Bridge Park. So if you go up north, kind of towards Washington Heights, where High Bridge is, there's a little trail that goes behind. You can actually find quite a bit of bats and quite a bit of activity in that park in particular.
In my experience, a lot of times people think they're seeing birds flying around at dusk, but they're actually bats. So actually, you go out and look almost anywhere at dusk, not in the wintertime, but in the summertime, you will see flying bats. Okay, it's time to move on now. These are some great questions. Please keep them coming, and we'll be back to answer them in a few minutes. But first, let's watch a video featuring vampire bats at one of my field sites at Lamini Archaeological Reserve in Belize.
You smell the ammonia as soon as you come in. See them? Neat, eh?
Yeah. Those are vampire bats?
These are vampire bats, yeah.
There are 1,300 living species of bats. That is about 20 to 22% of all living mammals.
It's this one here. Oh, there's a bat.
We think that the great diversity of bats has to do with the fact that they occupy a really unusual niche for a mammal. That is a nocturnal flying mammal niche. Beautiful. So you have some roosting high up in trees, others close to the ground.
Bugger.
and different bats eating different kinds of things. Nectar feeders, fruit feeders, carnivores, insectivores, and even blood-feeding bats, the vampires. I'm an evolutionary biologist, interested in the evolution of diversity in body form of mammals, diets of mammals, species diversity of mammals. And bats are just a wonderful group to work on because they're so diverse, so interesting, they do so many different things. Typical night of catching bats begins at about 5 o'clock. We need to give ourselves an hour, hour and a half to get everything situated before the bats wake up.
Oh, we got a fourth. Oh, it got out. Spoke too soon.
Bats can be told apart with a variety of different traits. The size and shape of the nose leaf varies from one species to another.
What was there?
The vampire bat.
There are bats that have stripes above and below their eye. Shape of the ears can vary. This is a little nectar-feeding bat. Has a long tongue that it can put inside flowers. So just looking at the outside of the bat, you can tell a great deal about what species it might be. There you go.
No.
Desmodus rotundus. Need help? Nope. Okay. That's that standard vampire sound.
There are 3 species of vampire bats: the hairy-legged, the white-winged, and the common vampire bat. In this portion of Belize, we only find the common vampire bat.
Onto my naked hand.
The 3 species all feed on blood, but the hairy-legged bat only feeds on bird blood. The white-winged bat feeds on bird blood, and there have been records of them feeding on mammalian blood. But the common vampire bat specializes on feeding on mammals.
Not want to be tangled up
Then
in
make
that.
for
There we
up
go.
for it, and
Now
there
you're
you
looking
are.
photogenic.
Nice mug. We don't entirely understand why there are 3 vampire bat species, what kind of diversification has happened there. And so using molecular biology, sequencing DNA, we can really get at this question.
A long-standing goal in molecular evolution is to understand which are the changes in individual genes that have made each species unique. So my research group has undertaken a large-scale screen of genes that are candidates for having undergone positive selection. One of the genes that we came across was the gene for plasminogen activator in vampire bats. All organisms have what's called plasminogen activator, which is active in their tissues and plays an important role in maintaining blood flow throughout the body. In vampire bats, adaptive changes have enabled them to express the activator in their saliva. So when they bite an animal, it helps to keep blood flowing, allowing the vampire to keep feeding. So here we are at the vampire bats, and we've separated out the bat activator. When we look at changes in individual genes, we're ultimately asking how does it affect the fitness of the organism? The probability of surviving, of finding a mate, and of reproducing. And so this is the biological currency in which evolution works. When we think about things like blood feeding, if you're able to get a new food source and to reproduce faster, then that's increasing your fitness and makes you more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce. So plasminogen activator is a crucial promoter of breaking up blood clots. Within vampire bats, when we started this work, the idea that there were changes to this gene in vampire bats was already known to science. However, it was not known how this related to the blood feeding behavior of different vampire bat species. When we compared the genes of the 3 species, we found that they were different. While the hairy-legged vampire, which feeds on bird blood, had a normal activator, a modification to the gene in the white-winged and common vampire bat appeared to be related to the ability to feed on the blood of mammals. Mammals have a mechanism that enables them to shut off the activator when bleeding becomes dangerous, allowing blood to clot. The change that we found in the white-winged and common vampire bat enables them to override this clotting mechanism and keep blood flowing in mammals they bite. Once we've sequenced a gene, we can build a gene tree reflecting the evolution of that gene. We can then take that gene tree and correlate it with the species tree, adding discoveries of genetic changes within that species.
So I think this is actually an elegans. See how the knees are naked?
Everything that we observe in how a species interacts with its environment will have some basis at some level in genetics. And so understanding the genetic processes that give rise to how species are different and how they interact differently with the environment is a fundamental scientific question that enables us to understand species in general.
The age of genomics has just opened up so many new areas for research. We're able to answer questions that in the past biologists would have liked to know the answers to, but there were no tools. So basically, it's a whole new toolkit that lets us address all kinds of interesting biological questions that we just couldn't get at before.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that video. I love being in the field, and that's been a marvelous experience working on that project and others in Belize. Number of questions have come in while the videos were playing about what we know about bats and COVID-19 and diseases in general. So I want to start off by saying that, first off, bats as a group don't host more viruses than other groups of mammals and birds. There was a paper published just a month ago that showed that groups with more species have more viruses. As we talked about earlier, there's an awful lot of different species of bats. On a per species basis, bats host no more viruses than other groups of mammals. Now, what about COVID and SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes it, and where we think it came from? Well, very soon after the outbreak of COVID-19, scientists sequenced its DNA and compared it to the genomes of other known viruses. They found that SARS-CoV-2 belongs to an evolutionary radiation of coronaviruses whose natural hosts are bats. Its closest known relative is a virus that was found in a horseshoe bat in China in 2013. That bat virus has a genome or set of genes that's 96% similar to the human virus. Now that number sounds very high, but for context, humans and chimpanzees have genomes that are 95% similar. Clearly, we're not the same. So the human virus and the bat virus are not the same, and indeed, they're no more similar than humans are to chimps. In fact, there are no known cases of a bat having SARS-CoV-2. It's a human virus. However, because it belongs to a group of viruses that are mostly hosted by bats, and because its closest relative is a bat virus, we have to conclude that it originated at some point in the past from bats and somehow got into humans. Based on how fast coronaviruses are thought to mutate, it's been estimated that the human virus that emerged in 2019 and the bat virus, which was collected in 2013, actually separated some 40 to 70 years ago. Where has the virus been all this time, and how did it get into people? Well, scientists just don't know yet. Most viruses are very particular about what host species they infect. They've evolved to infect and replicate in the cells of one species or one group of animals, and they cannot easily do so in others due to the machinery of how they infect cells and replicate. When a virus jumps or spills over into a new host species, a whole slew of factors have to align to make this possible. Among other things, there has to be contact of some kind between an infective host animal and a new host animal or human. This can be very direct, one animal eating another, but can also be indirect, can be transferred through droppings or aerosols, coughing, for instance. So this is where human behavior comes in. If I had one takeaway from this for you, it would be that humans are to blame for this pandemic, not animals. In most cases of animal to human virus spillover, it's human activities that start it all. So activities that increase human-wildlife interactions like habitat destruction, urbanization, bringing people and domestic animals into close contact with wildlife, intensive animal farming, hunting, and live wildlife markets. So it's really humans that are the cause for the current pandemic, not bats.
One really interesting thing to point out is that often, well, the theme nowadays in everybody's mind is obviously COVID-19, but very often when we hear about bats also, we have certain associations with the rabies virus. And that is very much true. Bats, like any other mammal, could carry the rabies virus, right? However, the incidence of rabies in bats is actually not high enough to pose a really dramatic risk compared to any unvaccinated wild mammal. When we look at the rates of viruses across all mammals, I mean, I would say you might actually be more likely to get rabies from an unvaccinated cat or a street cat or something like that than would it be to come across a bat that is positive for rabies where you get actually infected. That is not to say that bats are actually safe to go play with, right? Just like any other wild mammal. I would not really encourage anyone without training to go start poking at different animals in general, right? Especially, some of those that actually may carry disease. So we have other questions coming up, like for example, one really interesting question is, why is the number of bats decreasing in the world? And Nancy just talked a little bit about some of the reasons why. Obviously, direct hunting is a really big issue with some of the bat species across the world, but habitat fragmentation also poses really dramatic risks for many of these species. When we actually look at a search in general for all bats that have been classified in some level of threat by the IUCN or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, we see that over 30% of all of the bat species that are in this database are at some level of risk. Many of them actually being vulnerable or others being really critically endangered. And most of these threats primarily are actually coming from, very similar events like, again, habitat destruction and fragmentation, direct hunting, or other types of disturbance, whether direct or indirect, driven particularly by humans.
Yeah, we're the problem, not the animals. One of our other viewers has asked what I consider to be a fun question, and that is, can we describe what it's like for bats raising their babies in a cave? Do they make nests? Well, bats don't nest. What we describe it as is roosting, because they hang by their hind feet, most commonly from surfaces. So that surface might be the roof of a cave, or it might be branches in a tree, it might be under a leaf. Bats roost in all kinds of different places depending on what species they belong to and what's available. When bats give birth, they typically give birth to only a single really huge offspring. So when we catch bats in the field and they're pregnant, sometimes they're just so huge, it's almost unbelievable. As somebody, I have 2 children myself, and to just imagine being pregnant with something that's, it'd be like me having a 50-pound baby. Anyway, they give birth to a single large offspring, and species which live in colonies, the mothers often park all the babies together in one part of the cave, and the mother will go off and forage for food, catching insects or finding fruit, and come back, and the mother can find her own baby by a combination of its odor and also the sounds that it makes. So in a cave full of thousands of baby bats, the mother will find her individual baby to feed it and care for it. Mother bats can also carry their young. The way that they do this is the bat clamps on with its the baby bat clamps on with its teeth to the mother's nipple and holds on with its hind legs wrapped around her. And mother bats can fly to move their babies to new roosts that way. But they look after their babies the same way that other mammals do, by feeding them with milk. And they're really very good moms. Baby bats grow fast, and of course they have to learn to fly at some point. But until then, the babies are cared for in great care by their moms. The bat mothers are amazing.
We're going to answer another question. One of our viewers asks, does it make sense to install bat houses or other ways to attract bats in your backyard to help with the mosquito population? Well, let me tell you, the answer is yes. I mean, if you were to ask me, but of course I am a bat nerd. Any way that you can actually have a bat nearby, I mean, I guarantee you, you're going to be fascinated by how, incredibly amazing these beasts are, right? Especially when I think that the importance of having some sort of way, like to not necessarily attract them, but installing a bat house to provide alternative roosts for some of our bat populations becoming especially important for the region where we live. Because as you may know, many of our bat populations in this area, and actually throughout the United States and Canada, have been pretty much hammered by a little fungus known as white nose syndrome, right? And many of these populations have reduced dramatically and in terms of their numbers, some of them actually becoming quite endangered in a region. So having alternative roosts for bats to kind of temporarily use here and there, it actually would be very beneficial to help us sustain these populations and help them connect from one roost to another, right? Plus, of course, they can actually provide a little bit of a natural bug repellent type of service. So it's a win-win for both of you guys.
So I think we have time for one last question. And Sarah Jane has asked, do bats chatter? Do they have a kind of language? Well, actually, this sort of feeds into the having a bat house. If you have a bat house on your house or in your yard, on your garage, in your barn, up on your building, whatever, and you listen carefully during the day, you can often hear bats chattering because in fact, they talk a lot to each other. They're very social animals. And when bats are chattering to one another, they do it in the frequency zone that humans can hear. So it's within the zone of human hearing. When they're using sound, using echolocation to detect obstacles or catch prey, those are much higher frequency sounds that you can't hear that are above the sound of human hearing. But bats, when they're doing their own thing and they're back in their roost during the day, they sleep most of the day, but then just before they're ready to wake up in the evening and start getting active, they can make a lot of noise. And it's wonderful to hear them squeaking and whistling and chattering to each other and wondering what they're saying. Of course, we never know, but it's one of those things that biologists wonder about.
All right, folks, I think that we're going to call it a wrap for today. Thank you so much for all these exciting questions. You could probably tell we're really excited to answer all your questions and to hear from you what you're curious about bats. I hope you really enjoyed this live. And if you want to learn more about the work that we do, you can quickly search for the Mammalogy Department at the American Museum of Natural History, or also you can actually search for my lab at Rutgers University.
This was great fun. The museum, we have a great time doing these things. It's marvelous for scientists at the museum for us to get to share our research and our passions for the kinds of work that we do. The museum's doing new broadcasts every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time right here on the AIM&H YouTube channel. Next Friday, July 3rd, our colleagues in the Astrophysics Department will be taking us to visit asteroids. So subscribe to this channel for more of these great live streams and science videos.